Also, guten Tag, Herr Welser-Möst, and welcome, and thank you very much for finding the time to have a chat with me on IDAGIO Live.
Sure, it's my pleasure. Nice to see you again, even though it's a big distance, yet we're so close.
Yes, yes. I'm again. I mean, I had the privilege to meet you. Of course, I mean, you are such a legend in the conducting world, and I was thrilled to meet you in person in Milan when you came to conduct the Nozze di Figaro when I was there, and I was very lucky to be able to just basically sit behind you and see you in action from so close. And then, of course, I came to hear your Ariadne of Naxos, and when I was a student in Vienna, I heard you in many concerts, and I was fascinated by to see how actually clear and elegant your vision of the music can be, especially given that you approached, for example, here in Milan, you approached two pieces which are very similar and also very different. I mean, Mozart, the Nozze di Figaro, and then Strauss, Ariadne of Naxos. Now the question is, what is your secret to be so transparent and so well balanced in the actual shaping of the lines and with an orchestra?
You know, I think first of all, it starts all in your imagination, in your head, what you want to hear. And as you know, conducting we have different ways to communicate with an orchestra. It's, of course, in rehearsals, we can say certain things. We have our sort of silent language with showing with the stick what we want. But I believe there's also, the better the orchestra is and the better the conductor is, there is another way of communication which doesn't need words. And great musicians, sensitive musicians who have respect for a conductor, they will read his or her mind. And they will, by instinct, if you want, they will produce certain things which you even don't have to ask verbally for. And I always say, why has the composer undertaken the effort to write all this down if you can't hear some of it, you know? And so I have to say a lot of that I learned really in Cleveland. Cleveland always has been an orchestra which was famous for its balance, internal balance and transparency. And so I sort of learned a lot from them when it comes to transparency. And the other thing is when you have to know, because you mentioned Le Nozze di Figaro and Ariadne of Naxos, you have to know where a composer comes from. So in the case of actually both of them, first Mozart, the two items, the two topics which were most discussed at the end of the 18th century amongst German, but also some English and French philosophers, and they all were into the arts, were freedom and beauty. And Richard Strauss was sort of, first of all, his musical god was Mozart. He said that many times. And like at his 75th birthday party, members of the Vienna Philharmonic at his request played Mozart chamber music, the same at his 80th birthday. Mozart was his absolute musical god. And so he internalized the same sort of approach that there has to be a classical transparency and beauty.
And actually, as you're saying, I mean, the sound I heard when you were conducting also in Salzburg, I mean, with the Vienna Phil and here in Milan, was never forced, was always so round and beautiful, which is actually very, which is remarkable, because the tendency is sometimes to push in certain repertoire, because it sounds so testosteronic. Somehow it can actually carry people away. But we're always so aware of what actually the needs to convey the tension of the dynamic Dosierung. Was actually very clear to everyone in the hall.
You know, I think it's highly interesting that we have this conversation in these dark times. You are sitting in Milan, I'm sitting in Austria. We are both in lockdown. Because I believe actually that what you just said, that in the last, let's say, 10 to 20 years, there has been a way of music making which was going exactly for that sort of last kick. It has to be louder, it has to be more extreme. And I believe that actually now the needs of an audience will change, or have already changed without us knowing. Because what do you take, what's so great about a piece like Ariadne? In different times, you get out of a piece like that different emotions, which you as a listener need at that moment. And so I believe I always was fascinated by beauty. And especially, I was very privileged when I was 19. I was introduced to Herbert von Karajan, and he invited me to come to his rehearsals, and nobody else was allowed in there, maybe his wife and one of his staff members. But very often I sat alone in his rehearsals, sometimes right behind him, like in Salzburg at the Easter Festival. And you know, he was always seeking that beauty in the sound. I have to say, I learned more from singers than actually from great conductors in a way. I'm a singer freak, and I love great singing. And like when we did Ariadne in Milan, when we did it again in June, there was Tamara Wilson singing. What a voice that is, and what she can do with the voice. And also the Bachers Michael König, who sort of made it really effortless. But for me, the voice is the most original instrument. And when you read the old theoretical books, if it's Leopold Mozart, if it's Quantz, and so on, they all somewhere, they refer to the human voice. That's what you should try to achieve on any instrument. So my ideal is always, if it's a timpani player, if it's a xylophone player, I want everything to sing. That's sort of my obsession.
Of course. The cantabile quality of the sound.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. You know, I mean, like even bass lines where the double bass is sort of sometimes just give the impulse to a melody which happens in the violins or in the flute, whatever. But yet, also these notes, I think, or a timpani player that has to sing. I think, especially in that repertoire we are talking about, beauty is still a top priority for all these composers.
In my opinion, you do represent the culmination point of the idea of finesse in the conducting, because everything you conduct, it sounds so refined and so, as you were saying, cantabile and elegant. And again, I'm a Strauss freak myself, and I'm completely obsessed with Strauss music, and I can never get enough of it. And what I feel, I only conducted Ariadne of Naxos once, and but literally one show. And what I feel while doing it is that the risk of exaggerating in certain aspects, or in certain trivial moments, or in certain characteristics of the music, might actually kill the actual beauty of the music. So the line is very fine and very easy to cross to get into something which sounds ridiculous. And
yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I always say, don't milk the cow when it's already dead. So I think it's something so true. Again, it comes really from what Richard Strauss, when you read about him, how he was as a thinker, as a thinking artist. When you read his letters with Hofmannsthal, when you read other letters he has written, he comes very much from, for him, there was, ancient Greek philosophy. Then there was the time of Mozart, the Age of Enlightenment. And then there was Friedrich Nietzsche. That's sort of his nutrition for his thinking. These three philosophical schools, which are connected, of course. So, in other words, this classical approach, and not a sort of self-indulgent, romantic, quote unquote, approach, that's what Richard Strauss needs. He needs the classical approach, which means clarity. Clarity, and let the music speak for itself, and don't try to make it sound cheap, because sometimes it can do that. So I think if you have this, and he was also, that there's a great story which Clemens Helsberg, the former chairman of the Vienna Philharmonic, told me. In 1944, Richard Strauss conducted and recorded some of his pieces with the Vienna Philharmonic. It's a wonderful recording. Heldenleben, Zarathustra, Death and Transfiguration, Don Juan, Till Eulenspiegel. And the principal second violin at that time, who had played Death and Transfiguration with Richard Strauss before, said, sort of challenging him, said, "Maestro, it will be again 22 minutes. You know, the habit of orchestra musicians writing into the parts at the end, how long this performance took with this conductor and that conductor." And Richard Strauss said, "No, 24 minutes. And I find that so interesting, because he had a very clear concept of timing, of tempo. Or when you listen to these recordings, and that's what, that's authentic, really. He himself called, he called himself an allegro composer. He Heldenleben, 38 minutes. That's really fast,
That's really
but
fast.
it never sounds rushed, which means he knew how to keep a pulse during a piece alive, and not giving that away, every 10 measures where there comes a perfect cadence and it's nice to take time, but then you get lost in the moment and you don't get the arch, which of course a great genius like Richard Strauss knows how to do.
That's also was actually, I found absolutely fabulous also about your Wagner, for example, that you did in Vienna. The idea of an arch, especially on these huge surfaces, vast material as a Wagner opera. You always found a way to shape an arch so that, everyone could be present at every step of the whole ladder, and everyone was climbing the ladder with you in a way that it never sounded heavy in the usual Wagnerian sense, but we always saw the seal, the destination point, and that is always very important, right?
Yeah, I think there's one thing, and there are different tastes, of course. Some people like the heavy Wagner, they like heavy Bruckner, or or extreme Gustav Mahler symphonies and so on. I come from a different sort of line. I love, for instance, one of my big heroes in the past is Bruno Walter, and because I like the how should I put that? I like the intellectual humility Bruno Walter had, who was an extremely well-educated, well-read man, yet he understood that he was a servant to the music. But coming back to your point, I think architecture in music is something very important. I tell you one story. When I was, I think I was 23 or 24, in my mid-20s, when I conducted my first St. Matthew Passion. And I analyzed it, you know, the scenes and so on. And I tried to get an overview. What Karajan always said, you should be like an eagle looking down on a piece, so you have the full, complete picture. What I did was not only trying to get a feeling for the different tempi of this aria or that aria, but actually I sat at home studying it, and with a stop clock, a stopwatch, taking the time for the rests in between the different movements, so that it would not be sort of, okay, in other words, not to lose the pulse of a performance, even though when you have a rest of 5 seconds or 10 seconds, whatever. And that's the same thing. What do you do in the beginning of the Tristan Vorspiel? You know, there has to be, even in the rests, there has to be a pulse. And the old composers talk a lot about pulse. That's not the same thing as a metronome. A metronome is a machine. Pulse is the human heart, you know. So, like, because talking about the first part of Ariadne, where so much is like a recitativo, it's all parlando, but you have to make sure that the timing also, like when the Haushofmeister comes and then delivers his spoken text, how you go into that, how you come out of that, that is all a question of pulse, that you don't lose that the music sort of doesn't come to a stop, even if you have a general rest or a spoken text. So there's always a flow which you create, which then hopefully for the listener, makes it an exciting and sort of a journey which feels then short.
Absolutely. And I mean, I felt exactly that also in the Marriage of Figaro you did. I mean, because it was, again, the architecture of the actual human pace of the music was very natural. And I mean, the risk, again, with even with an opera like Marriage of Figaro, which is so easy to listen to, can be so boring eventually. But you know, it went absolutely flawlessly through the 4 acts, and that, as you were saying, is clearly related to a sense of inner pulse, which is essential to music making, especially when you're dealing with huge pieces like that.
Yeah, but you have to figure out what the pulse of the piece is. You know, the composer actually writes the pulse. So it's not what you feel like. You have to figure out, as I said before, as an example, St. Matthew Passion, you have to figure out what the pulse is, what the composer intended. And in Marriage of Figaro, because you say that, you mentioned that, I read the other day a great line of a critic, a cultural critic, a famous one in the last century, end of the last century in America. His name is Clement Greenberg, and he said, the effect is, what he meant was the effect is not the interpretation. The substance is important. Substance, and that's our job, to find what is the substance of a piece, and especially with Mozart, which has so many different angles you can come from, because there is fun always, there's joy, but there's also depth. When the Count sings perdono, perdono at the end, I don't think that's a self-indulgent moment for the Count. It's a spiritual moment where he realizes what the human being, the Countess in this case, really is. That's where Mozart is so unbelievably loving. He loves human people. And that's, you have to make sure that the music never, I think even also in Gustav Mahler, never becomes self-indulgent. It has to serve a purpose. That's why great art was written.
Of course. I mean, it's so great to talk to you, and I would have billions of questions and topics to actually ask you and talk about, because it's actually very inspiring. I mean, as a young conductor, having this feedback from you, and it's revelating, because it really tells us what the substance of music should be, and not indulging into some sort of energetic, or how would I say, ultra modern sort of approach, but we need to relate to the actual substance of the text and what the composer wanted, and that's eventually our mission, of course, as interpreter.
Yeah, and I mean, I refer always back to the 10 rules Richard Strauss wrote for conductors. Well, one rule is conduct the music, not the audience. So it's what you've referred to, this energetic, it's great energy and all this, but in the end, it's really, it's about our job to convey. We're transmitters from the composer to the audience. But you know what? I think we're at the end of our time. I saw just the note, but we should continue that conversation.
I would really love to. Thank you very much indeed.
Let's meet again.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.